Here we go.
Wet is a game that I've had people requesting I take a look at for years now, and like putting off having to fold up a big pile of washed laundry or take the garbage out, it's been sitting on my shelf this entire time with me just trying to ignore it. Well, thanks to yet again another COVID cluster, I finally had the time to sit down and play through this thing.
Here we go.
So what is Wet? Well, I'm so glad you asked. It's a stylish third-person shooter developed by Artificial Mind and Movement in 2009, and published by the gaming industry's favourite punching bag Bethesda, with the main character voiced by Eliza Dushku.
I'm not sure you have it in you.
NANI? Playing as a mercenary named Ruby who gets mixed up in a plot over the son of a drug lord or something, which doesn't really go anywhere, and ultimately just ends up with Ruby murdering most of the people you interact with by the time the whole story comes to an end. I've seen a lot of people saying this game's a lot like Tarantino films.
I don't know.
The time this game came out, Tarantino had made 7 films, with only Kill Bill 1 and 2 having anything even remotely resembling what happens in Wet. And even then, the only real comparison is that they both have a female character that carries a sword. And to further my point, it's only in Kill Bill Volume 1 that she actually goes around killing a heap of people with that thing anyway. And as far as I can remember, I don't think the bride fires a gun in either 2 films. Wet's also lacking those numerous pop culture references, and the kind of witty dialogue Tarantino films are known for. In fact, I don't think there's a single joke in the entire game, and if there was, well, it sure bombed.
Sorry.
What I more think of when I played Wet was like a Robert Rodriguez film. It reminded me a lot of Desperado with the over-the-top action sequences and the way in which Ruby can shoot her weapons constantly without ever having to reload. Then on top of that, the bizarre characters and aesthetic has a bit of an anime vibe to it, most notably with Cowboy Bebop. But really, all of these comparisons are pretty insulting. And comparing the writing in this to a Tarantino film is like comparing The Catcher in the Rye to a Get Well Soon card.
I've lost interest.
It's called Wet, which really has nothing to do with the plot whatsoever. I mean, it's supposed to be an allusion to wet work and the copious amounts of murdering you do in the game, but even then, man, that's a bit of a stretch. Off that logic, it could have also been called Jump, Slide, or Shoot. And if nothing else, I gotta say that Wet does do a pretty decent job with the shooting. I mean, it's genuinely the best thing it has going for it, even if most of this has been seen before. This is a third-person shooter in the vein of other bullet time games like Max Payne and Stranglehold, only with a much higher focus on acrobatics. And Ruby is a pretty nimble gal. She can wall run, she can swing around poles and launch herself up into the air, she can slide on her knees, she can even use enemies as a springboard and push off them for a bit of a boost. And aside from shooting people, you can whip out your sword at any moment and move seamlessly into melee combat. The idea is that you're supposed to kill everyone as quickly as possible. Keep on moving around and getting that score multiplier up as high as possible to earn more points. And it really doesn't want to prevent you from being able to murder people. At any time, regardless of what you're doing, you can pretty much shoot and aim in any direction. It's a pretty smooth system, and I think it also might have been one of the first games to incorporate all of these movement mechanics into one package. These kind of mechanics are almost commonplace in fast-paced shooters these days, but for 2009, this was pretty awesome stuff. You know what wasn't commonplace back in 2009 though? VPNs. Yeah, this might be a good time to quickly take a moment to thank ExpressVPN for sponsoring this video. What's a VPN? Well, I'm so glad you asked. A VPN is something that's commonly promoted by YouTubers, and it's short for a virtual private network. Without using one of these, when you're connected to an unencrypted connection, you're putting all of your personal information at risk. Your emails, your passwords, but more importantly, your internet search history. Using a VPN though, all of your data goes through an encrypted tunnel, which means that other people can't gain access to it. ExpressVPN routes this information through over 3,000 servers, with you also being able to choose from servers in over 90 countries. What's great about this when it comes to online gaming is that it doesn't affect your speed either. I've had this thing on constantly and had consistent connections when gaming. And with ExpressVPN, I mean the connection speeds are really solid across the board. It's just also really good for changing your region on sites like Netflix. I mean, a recent good example of this was that they've just added Lethal Weapon 2 and 3 to the Australian site, but for some reason not the first film. But I could easily change my location to Japan and then watch the first film without any dramas. Not to mention, it also gave me access to a whole bunch of more anime series, not that I watched that stuff. Now look, I'd never promote something that I don't use myself, but even then, you don't really have to look all that far to see people saying good things about this. It's got great reviews on sites like CNET and TechRadar, but more importantly, it's got great user reviews. I've been using ExpressVPN for over a year now without any issues. They also offer 24/7 customer support. So in the year of the apocalypse 2021, there's still no reason to not be using a VPN at all times. To find out how you can get 3 months for free, head on over to expressvpn.com/gman and get started.
Beautiful.
The only downside, I think, is that there's not that much environmental interaction. Did you ever play that game called Stranglehold? It was a pretty cool Max Payne-inspired shooter written by John Woo that was a sequel to the film Hard Boiled that also happened to come out 2 years prior to this. In that game, you couldn't wall run or jump around like a rabbit on speed, but you could slide down railings, you could jump onto trolleys, swing on chandeliers, and also leap across tables and ledges while still firing your guns. You could shoot down air conditioner units, you could shoot signs off the side of buildings, among a whole heap of other creative ways to end a bad guy's life. In Wet though, outside of a few explosive barrels, there's very little ways you can actually interact with the environment, and it just makes the game world seem a lot more static and lifeless. I think the biggest problem though is that once you've played the first couple of levels, you've really seen all there is to see and do. As you get further into the game, you'll unlock a shotgun, a submachine gun, and an explosive crossbow, but they're really not all that much different to the starting pistols, which happen to have infinite ammo by the way, and can also be fired without ever having to be reloaded. There's some basic upgrades you'll unlock over time, but they don't change the combat loop all that much. It's kind of like ordering a side of baked potatoes with a steak dinner. I mean, yeah, it's nice having a bowl of potatoes, but that big juicy cut of ribeye with the pepper sauce is really the main attraction. You dig?
Damn it.
So I just think as a result, you'll probably spend most of the time jumping around, sliding or wall running as the primary method of dispatching enemies. You can't throw grenades, you can't take cover, you can't crouch. I mean, you don't even have any control over when bullet time activates. Just kind of happens whenever you perform an acrobatic move and start firing. So it's this really weird mix of cool gameplay elements combined with so many other glaring omissions.
Damn it.
Then add in those instances where Ruby just kind of ignores your inputs and refuses to wall run or grab onto that much needed pole you're trying to grab onto. I mean, there's nothing worse than knowing what you're trying to do in a game like this and then seeing it not register and watching yourself fail. And that's why I think that Wet just has this steady downfall the more you keep playing it. It's like it starts so high but then just has this constant slow decline. You go from this very explosive and enjoyable prologue where you're chasing after some guy running off with a suitcase you need. It's a high-octane introduction that introduces you to the vast majority of the mechanics. Also, a lot of the key characters. Because it turns out the suitcase has got a heart in it that one of the main antagonists needs for a life-saving operation. It's like a combination of Pulp Fiction meets the Tin Man in Wizard of Oz.
This heart will save your father's life, Mr. Ackers. He wouldn't survive the night without it.
But then after that, at which point you're more than familiar with how to play the game and ready to keep on kicking ass, it slows right down and makes you go through all of these needless training scenarios that kind of made me feel like I'm playing through Superman 64 or something. Yeah, at this point, you're forced into finishing all of these platforming sections, running through these glowing circles to get the fastest time possible. Do you need to do this at any point outside of these levels? No. So, what's the point? Well, that's a good question, along with asking why there's blood in my stools each morning. And if that's not enough, you have to come back here a bunch of times throughout the campaign, every single time you get a new weapon. What were they thinking?
Never mind. Not your problem.
But then even after that, when you finally get back to actual gameplay, you realize pretty early on that it really does struggle to shake things up. Every chapter pretty much plays out the same, right? You move through the level fighting enemies as they pop out of otherwise inaccessible rooms, or you get locked in a small arena, and then have to barricade a bunch of doors to stop enemies from constantly spawning in. Broken up with the odd platforming section in between, most of which are borderline unfailable. Is that a word? Later in the game, you have to deal with these absolute bullet sponges carrying miniguns who can only be killed through a quick time event. And then eventually there's enemies with swords who can deflect your bullets. Because, yeah, all you have to do to deflect bullets is hold a sword above your chest. And there's just not really much variety to the other basic enemies. They carry the same weapons as Ruby does, but they can still be dispatched pretty easily. But I mean, look, this is fine because the combat loop is enjoyable. It's just that pretending that this isn't repetitive is like trying to pretend that the earth isn't round, trying to pretend that the sky isn't blue, or trying to pretend that anime fans are real people. try to mix it up with these horrendous sections where you go into this kind of rage mode. This happens during a bunch of scripted sequences where Ruby executes someone at point blank range and then gets blood in her eyes. Then like 28 days later, she turns into a psychopath. The entire screen goes red, white, and black, well, mostly red, and you run around like a maniac, except that nothing's really changed. You're not invincible, you don't move faster, it's just that you can now kill enemies in a single hit with the sword. And I get that the point of this is to try to help you rack up a bunch of points quickly, but it's really just a little more than a screen filter over the same gameplay. And you know they were really running out of ideas later on here because they reused this about 3 times towards the end of the main story. The other thing I think is that whenever the game tries to do something completely different to just having you shoot and stab people is where it fails even more. The best examples are these short sections on the highways, which are a blatant ripoff of Matrix Reloaded. Yeah, and wouldn't you know it, one of the writers for this game worked on the visual effects in that movie. Yeah, what a coincidence. Then a bit later on, you're falling out of a plane and you have to find a parachute, all while shooting at enemies who are flying past you. I'd say that this bit here is a homage to No One Lives Forever, but I think that'd be giving the writers too much credit. The second highway level is even worse. This time you've got that obnoxious red filter across the screen because you're still in rage mode, and enemies this time are guys on motorbikes that don't even flinch when taking damage. This level also answers the question, how many times can you watch someone flip off a car bonnet before it gets boring? Surprisingly, the answer is less times than you'd think. Honestly too, my eyes were bleeding after this level. I felt like Jerry Seinfeld after he had to spend a night in Kramer's apartment with that Kenny Rogers sign keeping him up all night.
You look a little stressed.
Oh, I'm stressed.
I felt like I'd wandered the desert for 40 days and 40 nights without blinking, only to walk face first into a wall of salt. More than that though, these sections really are just about memorization because during these ones you've got no means to heal yourself, so it becomes a matter of killing enemies as fast as possible before you take too much damage. Yeah, you see, regaining health in this game is done by either drinking hard liquor, which makes sense, or by getting your score multiplier up, which increases the health regeneration time, or is that decreases? During these levels though, you don't get that score multiplier, so you have no possible way of getting your health back, which means, like I said, it becomes just a matter of shooting enemies as fast as possible and memorizing where they come from. Throw in a few quick time events during these sequences as well, and you've completed every slice of that trial and error pie. And that's really one of the main things that pissed me off with this game, all those lame trial and error traps. And I really did think a lot of this has just been done to try to pad the game's length out, considering it's really only about a 4 to 5 hour long game at the best of times.
I'm glad you approve.
I most certainly do.
But I think where Wet suffers the most though is its horrendously bad writing, featuring uninteresting, boring and forgettable characters, with Ruby sadly being one of the main offenders. Annoyingly too, you can't afford to not pay attention during cinematics, because they'll throw the odd QuickTime event into them here and there, and it's easy to get killed if you're not paying attention and miss that on-screen prompt.
Fuck you, lady.
Some of these cinematics also serve as the closest thing we get to boss fights, because all of the main antagonists you encounter are defeated through a series of on-screen button prompts, and ones that aren't really all that hard either. I mean, shit man, Resident Evil 5 was doing the same thing in 2009 as well, and that felt dated when it came out 6 months before Wet did. Never mind it being antiquated though, I mean it's also just lazy. Was the simple notion of including basic boss fights too much of a hindrance for the devs to add in here? The biggest problem though is Ruby. She's just such an unlikable character, and completely devoid of any kind of charisma.
Be at the parade grounds in 20 minutes. Where is Trevor Ackers? Call off your dogs.
I'd say that she's got resting bitch face, but that'd be a compliment to the animators, which isn't deserved because there's barely any facial animation to speak of. Some of the dialogue just sounds weird and like it needed a couple more takes in the recording booth.
Let me rephrase my question.
And I don't even know what the hell kind of sound she's making here when she dies. It's like the sound you make when you're imitating a Formula 1 car going racing past. Ruby is just such an unlikable person that even the sight of her wearing a thong and knee-high boots later in the game is somehow unappealing. At that point, it's like seeing Hitler wearing lingerie. I mean, it might have gotten a rise out of me, metaphorically and literally, except she's such a shrew that I just stopped caring.
Fuck you!
And this is also too, I think, why seeing people compare this to Kill Bill really pisses me off. You're comparing a wooden, 2D character like Ruby to someone like the Bride, who goes through a whole range of emotions and moods to the point where it's kind of like she's playing entirely different characters.
No kidding, I heard it was kind of hard.
I want him to know. I want him to know.
The other thing too, I think, is that the script in this just lacks any real kind of humour.
You can't do it, can you?
People swear a lot, but not in a fun or a clever way. It's just profanity used for profanity's sake, and I honestly lost count the amount of times that someone called Ruby a bitch.
Why is that bitch still alive?
You fucking bitch. You're too fucking late, bitch. You bitch! You fucking bitch! You're gonna leave me?
It's not witty, it's not intelligent, it's just lazy writing that kind of sounds like something a 14-year-old would come up with. It's like when you're insulting someone and can't think of anything clever to say to them, so you just attack the first thing that pops into your head. Kind of like calling someone fat or calling someone four eyes because they wear glasses, you know what I mean? They almost defy convention at one point where one of the characters calls her lady instead of bitch. Yeah, and I bet the writer spent all day trying to come up with that brain buster.
Sorry.
Even the other characters also have some pretty horrendous dialogue. Now look, I know I'm not exactly Ernest Hemingway when it comes to my scripts, and this critique is coming from a guy who still finds farts and your mum jokes to be funny. But also in my defense, I'm not being paid to write scripts for video games. And I think that if I was, I'd try to be a bit more creative than coming up with a line like calling someone a turd in a punch bowl.
You're like a turd in a punch bowl, Ruby.
The writing makes Anthony Birch seem like Arthur Conan Doyle in comparison.
This pain is only going to get much, much worse.
Yeah, check out this amazing line when Ruby finally beats the big bad guy for the ending. It's just rubbish.
Fuck you.
No. Fuck you.
Fuck you.
I also kind of started to wonder if maybe they just miscast Ruby. Now, I know she's voiced by Eliza Dushku, and like other men of culture, I've got a bit of a fondness for her. And anyone who was a teenager in the early to mid 2000s is probably going to remember her as Faith in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And how?
Kill me?
And yeah, look, she's a cool actress who's nailed that tough chick persona in the past. But here though, I think she just misses the mark. Or, I don't know, maybe it's just that if you write your character to be an unlikable asshole with very little redeeming qualities, outside of them being purely physical, well, then they come across as an unlikable asshole. Yeah, funny that.
Why is that bitch still alive?
The final aspect where Wet really misses the mark too is the licensed music in the soundtrack, which is some of the most obnoxious, annoying music I think I've ever heard in a video game. And can anyone tell me why this is a game that seems to be trying to go for a 1970s grindhouse vibe that also uses punk rock from the mid-2000s?
Attention, please. A $50 reward will be paid for information leading to the arrest and conviction of anyone caught stealing our speakers.
Now look, the original music in the soundtrack is pretty damn good, but the licensed music in this is fucking horrible, and I really hope that someone lost their job over this. The worst one is during that rage mode, where it's just the same tracks looping endlessly until you beat the section. I feel like it's the kind of music I should be hearing while grinding a rail in an abandoned warehouse, not a game where I'm cutting people up with a sword, just out of place. And lastly, not that it really matters much at this point, but this really isn't a very good looking game either. Ruby looks decent enough for the time, but again, the other character models are just kinda horrible.
This is some bullshit.
And it's that weird art style that doesn't seem to know if it wants to be cartoonish or realistic, sitting somehow in the middle and failing at both. I even had a few glitches like loading screens that didn't load, and at one point a camera angle didn't change during a cinematic and I couldn't see what was going on, which was actually pretty funny.
Ruby, why is this happening?
Too late.
Hello, Ruby.
Shit!
But you want to know the final insult? There's no New Game Plus mode, or even the option to go back and replay chapters. Yeah, if you finish the game without finding all of these hidden monkeys or upgrading all of the weapons, well, that's too bad. You have to do this whole thing in a single playthrough. Now look, I get that it's a really short game and is designed for replayability, but it just seems like a pretty weird omission, especially considering how commonplace that kind of feature was in gaming by this point. You know what really stunned me though was how many people really seem to love this game. And you don't have to look all that hard to find people giving it glowing reviews. You consider when this game came out, which was 2009, the height of the Xbox 360 and PS3 era, which I really do think created some of the most hardcore player bases maybe of all time. I mean, look at the staunch fanboys for games like Halo and Gears of War, or on Sony's side, the fanboys for Killzone or the Uncharted games. This generation of consoles produced some really hardcore gamers, who really attached themselves to these franchises, and that's why you can still see people defending these games even now in 2021. Or, I don't know, maybe they're just blinded by nostalgia. I'm definitely guilty of that myself, I think, for a few games that probably haven't aged as well as I'd like to admit. Overall though, to me, Wet just felt like a jack of all trades and a master of none. God, I love that saying.
Why is this happening?
Now apparently they originally planned for a sequel, which does make sense because Wet ends on a bit of a cliffhanger ending. But when Bethesda washed their hands with it, well, I guess that was pretty much the final nail in the coffin.
Yeah, got it.
So if you want to play a game that captures that whole grindhouse feeling and actually manages to be both fun and enjoyable, well, go play House of the Dead Overkill. I think I laughed more times playing through this once than I've ever laughed at every other video game I've ever played.
Make him mad, and he'll rip your balls off.
And yeah, look, that game has a lot of profanity, I think even more than this, but it's profanity that's written ironically for a single character.
You ever thought of therapy?
If you want a shooter that nails that destructive gun-fu element, well, then go check out Stranglehold. It lacks a lot of the acrobatic elements to the gameplay that Wet manages to pull off, but it's still a more consistent game tonally and stylistically. Not to mention, shooting someone in the dick in that game never gets old. Also, Chow Yun Fat could read through the phone book with a throat infection and a hangover and still be more fun to listen to than Ruby is.
Here we go.